thank you for coming. Great to see such a great crowd. We're worried when there was one or two people at about a couple of minutes to 8 o'clock, so thanks again for taking the time to come out. I promise to do more kind of farm highlights and more in-services for Fresh. We don't have that many, so it's really my great pleasure to bring Lee McFadden in from Mariposa Farm. I won't go into the whole history and details because I think that's a big part of the presentation, but I will tell you that probably one of our first farm direct suppliers that we had as a company. And so it really started with Gary. Again, Lee will tell you the whole story. And I've had the pleasure to be on her farm for the last 18 years in a row and see her kids grow and grandkids grow and to be part of that history. So I'm just going to leave it there and leave it to you, Lee, and we'll have time for questions. And I think it's up to Lee, if you don't mind interruptions, if you want questions along the way or save it all.
I'm fine with people putting their hand up, and I'll take a question. I'll be happy to do that. I might need a prompt to take me back to where I left off, but that's okay.
Right.
Not a problem.
All right, great, thanks.
So, Mariposa Organic Farm, which was established in 1962. First organic farm in the Okanagan-Similkameen valleys. So it has a long history. And I'll just give you a little brief history of why it is there. My late husband, who died in 1998, was a World War II veteran, and when he was in Italy, he fell in love with grapes. Grapes, but wine. He fell in love with wine. And his idea was to come back to Canada after the war, go to work, save money, and buy some land. So his search started actually in the 1950s, which is long before most of you were even a twinkle in your parents' eyes. And he looked around the Okanagan and he looked around the Similkameen and he went to this particular piece of land and he actually leant against this pine tree. Didn't look up at the land that he was buying or was potentially buying, but looked out across the river and up at these two beautiful mountains and leant against this magnificent ponderosa pine tree. And he said he literally felt the energy of this soil flowing through the tree into him. He didn't ask how many acres it was. He didn't ask how much money it was. He didn't ask any of the questions he'd asked about 100 other pieces of land. He turned to the realtor and he said, "I'll buy it." And the realtor said, "Well, it's 250 acres. "Oh, well, how much is it?" $18,000. What? So it was a done deal. He bought it. And then he set about planting grapes. And he planted about 35 acres of grapes in all of this land here that's cleared. That's a little inset photo. But the timing was very, very bad. It was a totally different political system. Well, the same system, but a different government with a different political agenda in Victoria. And he could not get a winery license. And having grapes without a winery license was a no-go. He was getting $20 a ton, less than the cost of production, selling to Andre's Winery. There were two wineries at the time in BC. You know how many there are now. The Okanagan-Similkameen has vineyards everywhere, more vineyards than apples now. And so I met him in 1969, and I joined him in 1970, and he moved there in 1962. And at that point, he was on the brink of losing the land because he couldn't get a winery license, he couldn't sell grapes for a reasonable price, and he was pulling his hair out, quite literally. So I said, okay, let's look at this. What can we do? We'll grow vegetables. Why not orchards? Because that's what the Similkameen was known for, beautiful tree fruits. Well, in those days, it took 5 years to get a crop. We didn't have 5 years. We'd have lost the land. So we went right into growing vegetables, which meant that fall there was a crop. And we never looked back. It was also on the cusp, on the absolute beginning of the wave of people wanting organically grown foods. Not a lot of people, but enough people. And in fact, I don't know if any of you remember, the big health food store in Vancouver. I can't remember the name of it, but the fellow that started one of the first health food stores in Vancouver, at that point, was just buying truckloads of food, calling into farms, buying a truckload of food, taking it over to Vancouver Island, stopping at his intersection, because there were a lot of truckers doing this in those days, and selling it off the back of his truck. He went on to start a health food store on Quadra Island, and then he started a big health food store in West Vancouver, and we supplied him right from the day that he was trucking on through. Then in 1979 or 1980, a fellow named Gary, who you might all be familiar with, wandered down off the highway being up here, and wandered down into the farm and ate a yellow watermelon with us. And he said, "Oh, never eaten anything like that. I want thousands of them next year." So the next year we planted thousands, and the deer ate 999 of the thousands. But anyhow, we did have enough that we were able to ship to Gary, to community, in its original location. And then there began our long, long, wonderful relationship with this store and with your customers. Even though they don't know us, and a lot of them don't know this land, I view them as our customers. You're the person who delivers to those customers, but they're buying our produce, and that to us is very, very important. And all through these years of association with community, the number one important thing to us has been to ship you quality. If we do ship to you, and the quality isn't there, or something has happened to the produce, we accredit, no questions asked. I think in the whole time, all those years of shipping to community, we maybe have had to give you a credit 2 or 3 times, which is really quite wonderful. The other very, very important factor of shipping you quality and servicing the people who are your customers, our customers, is to ship to them mature as possible fruit, or vegetables really, because we only ship melons to you as a fruit. Because the greener a product is picked, the further away it is from maturity, the less nutrition they're actually getting. They're buying something that can look quite lovely, but it was picked quite immature. A squash is a very good example. They're quite often picked immature. They just don't get the nutrition that they're paying for. So they're paying the price, but they're not getting the health benefit that they should be from organically grown, from all produce, but particularly from organically growing produce in a health food store, because we're selling health, and we should be delivering what we're promising. So from our end of it, that is what we try to do. We try to deliver as much of what we promise as we possibly can. And I think that has been very, very important. One of the other things that has been very important to Bob when he purchased the land, he was, like a lot of veterans, at times quite a difficult person to get along with, because he had a very strong set of ethics. And when he truly believed in something, and that would be after considerable research, it wasn't a scatterbrained, hairy idea, but if he truly believed in it, he was immovable. And that could be, you either went along with his ethics or you went into a bit of a brick wall. He was a very, very strong environmentalist. I don't know, have any of you read or do any of you know of Rachel Carson? You do? So for you young people who are interested in the environment, she wrote a book, the landmark book called Silent Spring, which wrote an expose on the agricultural chemicals that were being used up until 1962. Many of them were banned in the late 1960s, DDT being the one that many of you may know of. And if you're readers, I would really recommend going to a second-hand bookstore and buying a copy of Silent Spring. And don't worry about reading all the technical part, because in parts it gets quite technical. But read the introduction at least to every chapter. It's beautifully written, it's lyrical, it establishes a love affair with this soil. And we sometimes forget that this soil, this earth that we live on, this soil that we grow in, this soil that we build on, this soil that we constantly degrade and do terrible things to, provides us with every single thing that we need to live. Now, what's this? And what's this plastic stuff and this plastic stuff? Well, the basic components for all of these material began in the soil. Our food is from the soil, our housing is from the soil, everything is. And we treat it like a commodity that can be kind of thrown away. So Bob was very, very strong about taking care of the soil, and Rachel Carson was his mentor, if you like, through the written word. And this book could give you a lot of understanding about why we do some of the things today that we didn't do pre-1962. Her book had such a monumental impact that when President Kennedy read it, he started the Environmental Protection Agency. And he set about banning DDT, or the Environmental Protection Agency did. So that book had a monumental effect on the time after its publication. See if you can do that. So he decided, or we decided, that we've got 250 acres. If we farmed 250 acres, we would literally be pulling our hair out. I knew what big farming was because I grew up on a big farm in Australia. I was the 6th generation to live on a family farm, and it was large. And I remember that very well. And it was also one of the reasons I didn't want to do tree fruits, because we grew tree fruits. And I got sick of scrambling up ladders and looking up into the sun, and it didn't work for me. So out of that, his big plan had been to have about 100 acres of grapes and have a winery. So when the winery couldn't come and we went into the vegetables, we had a whole look at a lot of things. And we decided, we made a very conscious decision that for us, big was not better. That we were better off, our personalities, the energy we had, our mindset was better with staying fairly small and keeping a very hands-on approach so that we had control over what was happening. And we could hand select our staff, and we were just in a closer relationship with the soil and with the products that we were producing. So we decided to leave. Oh, and at the same time that we were coming to these realizations, we were beginning to realize that the 220 or so acres that we weren't raising crops on, were unique in Canada. That there was an awareness developing that this area housed more threatened species than any other part of Canada. That we had a unique piece of land, and that it was our responsibility to steward it. And to this day, we still totally steward 130 acres in one lump piece, and about another 20 or another 15 acres in various little pieces. On the land, actually in these pine trees, is an ancient Indian burial ground, and that is registered with the Heritage Department of the provincial government, and nothing, it has a covenant on it, and nothing can ever happen to that. Above the highway, we have another Indian burial ground, same thing there. And so the whole concept of growing organically, taking care of the soil, building the soil, because in the end, that's really what organics is about. It has become about not being contaminated. But it actually started out being about the soil, caring for the soil. And if you care for the soil and you have a good soil biota and the soil is healthy, your plants will be healthy, and you're not going to need to take as much remedial action as you do when you constantly are depleting the soil. And that has been very true for us. We have very few pest problems. We don't have disease problems. Pest problems, even in the best organic system, will always be a problem. And there's always new organic solutions coming up to deal with them. In vegetables, fortunately, we don't have as many. So that makes it easier for us. So the stewarding the wildlands so that the native creatures who have an inherent value of their own could live safely, and producing food that hopefully was going to nurture and nourish a whole bunch of people out there, hopefully little children in particular who are growing into strong people, and hopefully will have a different mindset about this planet that they live on. the two have fitted very, very well together. So that covers why we went organic and how our relationship with community started. Does anyone have a question? Okay, then. So time went by, we had 3 little kids and they're growing up and they had lots of daily chores to do. And I might as well move on because what I wanted to do here was give you a photographic involvement with our farm, just through images. This Mariposa Organic Farm, this is the flower that the farm was named after. When Bob purchased the land in June 1962, all of the wildland was covered in this beautiful, beautiful flower. Now, how many have been through the Okanagan-Similkameen? When you drive through, it often looks kind of brown and uninteresting, or it can look very beautiful depending on your mindset. But it's a very dry climate, a semi-desert climate. We get less than 12 inches of precipitation, including snow, a year, which is extremely dry. But we have many, many exquisite flowers. And you pretty well have to, I'll go back. You pretty well have to be out on the landscape to see these little flowers because they're very close to the ground. So anyway, looking at the Mariposa, this beautiful flower, Bob said, the Mariposa. Spanish word for Spanish meaning of Mariposa is butterfly. And there was a Spanish legend that where the Mariposa grew well, so would the grape. And at those times, he was going to plant grapes, which he did, and they did flourish. The winery part, well, you know that story, didn't matter. The grapes flourished. So maybe there was something about the legend. Doesn't matter. We got the name, we stuck with it. So, spring. Exciting time of the year. So's fall, because it means there's no more work for a while. So you have a long winter sleep. Not quite, but sort of. And then spring comes. So as the soil is awaking, so are the human juices flowing, and you're really getting the energy to get out there and do things. So this is just a little synopsis of what a field looks like in the spring, what a cleared field looks like. This is planting a green manure crop. Are any of you familiar with what a green manure crop is? It's planting a crop deliberately that goes back to the soil. Part of the premise is that its roots are going to go deeper than the plants that we harvest from, and they will pull nutrients up from deeper in the soil than, say, a pepper plant can or a tomato plant can. Then when those plants are returned back to the soil, they will put those nutrients into the surface or the top few inches of the soil, and they're now available to the plants that we're growing to harvest. So we plant 2 types of green manure crop. We always plant a legume, and a legume is a pea or a bean or a peanut or an acacia tree. It's a huge family of plants, but they have quite a wonderful thing about them. On their roots, they develop a little nodule. A little soil microorganism goes to their root and scratches. You've got a root like that with a little root coming off, and it scratches in there. And it forms a gall, and then it enters into the gall, and there it lives. And that little gall on the root below the soil has the magical power, and I can only think of magic as the explanation because it's hard to explain it scientifically, although scientists can do it, but I'm not a scientist. That little gall can magically bring nitrogen from the atmosphere. And our atmosphere is full of nitrogen, and it's constantly cycling through the soil back to the atmosphere, like that. It's a constant process. So this little gall through the legume brings that nitrogen and stores it in the gall. And a healthy legume root will be covered in these galls. And you can put tons of nitrogen in an acre of soil the lazy way. You know, the difficult way is shoveling manure or, driving a tractor to load it onto a manure spreader. Much better just to plant the seed and let nature do what nature does very well. And then plow that in. You've gathered all this nitrogen, you've put it into the soil. you haven't got involved in the oil industry at all in doing so, whereas chemical fertilizer is an involvement with the oil industry. So you bypass that, yes.
So does it grow for a whole season and then you till it at the end of the season?
You have choices, but yes, that is what we do. We actually plant the pea in the fall, and there'll be a little photo of that later on. This is being planted in the spring, and we're actually planting clover here, and that will grow all year. We let that field rest from growing harvestable crops. Well, we're growing a harvestable crop, but we don't ship it. It goes back into the soil. And it grows all year, and then the next spring, when it's lush and green, because now we've set all that nitrogen from the atmosphere, but the green part has organic matter, and it has nitrogen, and it has a lot of all the nutrients that it's taken out of the soil. Every bit of iron, every bit of sulfur, magnesium, all of the nutrients that it's taken out are in the leaves, and they go back into the soil. And
How many years in a row would you plant your traditional vegetables before you would put in a crop like that?
2, yeah. We can go 3, and farming, like every other activity, is never perfect. So the ideal would be to do it every 2 years. Things happen sometimes and you can't. You know, there can be deaths, there can be illness, there can be all sorts of things happen, and you just can't. But if you go the 4th year, and I have had that happen, you really notice it. You notice it in a decline in the vigor of the plants that are growing in that soil if you go 4 years. And I've had that happen a couple of times, so I've really been able to witness that, and I've researched what they've done at universities with test plots and so on, and it follows through. So that's the spring. My granddaughter out there riding a horse, she's off now studying music at university. So there's green manures and compost. That's what the clover looks like. That's what the rye looks like, the rye being very, very deep-rooted, so it brings lots of nutrients up from deep down. The clover being somewhat more shallow, but it's setting. And one other thing that this heavy, heavy cover does, when it is applied properly, it really suppresses weeds. But it suppresses 2 other insects that we were having a lot of damage with. One is called, see, it's so long since we've had it, I can't remember, the wireworm. And the second one is cutworms. And if any of you are gardeners, you've probably had experience with wireworm and cutworm. And the hypothesis is that the cover is so thick on the soil that the moth that lays the egg for the cutworm, for the little worm that results, can't get to the soil to lay her egg. And the click beetle that lays the egg for the wireworm can't move through the soil to get to the soil to lay it. So it just goes somewhere else where they don't have to battle this heavy cover. And this, of course, is compost. That's the other component that is very, very important to farming. Not so much for the nutrients that the compost itself packs, but if any of you gardeners, you probably do use compost, or maybe you do composting simply because it's better than putting food wastes into the landfill, which is really not a very good thing at all. You know, it's much better to put it into compost even if you give the compost away. Does Calgary have a landfill composting system?
Starting to get it. Some neighbourhoods have like compost bins,
Mm-hmm.
and they're on like a trial basis, and then I think it goes citywide in 2018 or something.
Yeah, we're in trial
Yeah.
basis right now.
Well, BC is very progressive on that. Even the community that I live in, we have out in the country there for the last several years, we've had garbage pickup. We have all our recyclables in blue bags and the garbage in a garbage bin or whatever. But all of the compost, not for me because I'm on the farm and I keep my own, but in town, the compostable materials go to the dump, and they have a huge composting system at the dump. And then they sell that back to the locals as compost. And that has taken, and Vancouver is very strict about it. They have a huge composting program, which is a very good thing. So, of course, we do composting and we put that back on the soil, but more important with the compost, some rudimentary compost bins, and there is a woofer. Are you all familiar with woofers? Yeah. Okay, there's a woofer building compost bins for me. And this is where the compost is really, really important. It makes a wonderful base for the greenhouse soil mix. And growing in our northern climate, a greenhouse is essential. Most of the crops that we grow come from far off places. There are very few Native American crops, squash being one of them, beans being another. But most other crops we grow come from South America, Ethiopia, some other part of Africa. They come from places where you have a full year growing season. We have a very tight growing season, and it can vary from year to year. We, generally speaking, don't have frost beyond the end of March and don't have frost to the beginning of October. But we have had frost on the 4th of June, and we have had frost on the 4th of September, which really cuts the season short because those same crops are very frost tender. So two things have happened. There's been a lot of plant breeding to shorten the number of days from seed to mature crop, and you start in a greenhouse, so you get a 6-week start. So when you're planting a pepper plant out, you're planting a plant out, not a seed. If you planted a seed out, you might be beginning to get some fruit on there now, and frost is coming down tomorrow, so it's a no-go. So the greenhouse is very important. The compost and leaf mold provide a wonderful base for the soil in the greenhouse. Once again, compost is not particularly high in nutrients, but it's very high in, it'll be high in minerals, but not nitrogen. The nitrogen tends to gas off and rejoin the atmosphere, part of that constant recycling. But the other nutrients are stable, but it's porous and it's very high in organic matter, and when it goes to the soil, that organic matter, once again through a magical process involving soil microorganisms, that organic matter produces nitrogen, a slow release kind of nitrogen. So compost does a few things. Gets rid of the waste. You can compost it. It's no longer waste. You can burn it. Well, that's not so great. You can send it to the dump. Well, that's kind of stupid. So composting it is really the best thing to do. And to chop it up and put it into a compost, and you can get very, very technical about it, or you can be like me. I'm what I call a lazy farmer. There are so many chores on a farm, I've looked to nature. Oh, so there's this magical process whereby this type of plant will capture that nitrogen and put it in the soil, and I don't have to shovel as much manure. Great, that's the route I'm taking. Or same with putting the compost in. I can do all these other things to try and deal with it, easier to compost it. Any step I can take where nature will do the job for me, utilize her. She's the master, I'm just the student. So let nature do it. That's my thought on it, and it saves me a lot of work. So that's just some photos of the greenhouse, very healthy looking pepper plants, some tomato plants, chugging along, and they will be about that big when they're planted out middle May. We kind of watch the weather, see what the weather systems are doing, so we change the planting, see whether there's El Nino or El Nina out in the ocean, because that affects us directly. Farming in any one spot is not just farming there. You've got to look globally at what's happening, because weather systems start way down at the equator and they come up the Pacific and then they come in on us. And those weather systems, if it's El Nino, we can be pretty sure we're not going to have an early frost. If it's the other way around, we can be pretty sure we'll have a late frost. So you need to watch the systems, like we need to really with whatever we're doing. So, planting out onions, my grandson, my rear end. Some of the farm, chicken house, which is no longer there. These little cabins at the back are where woofers stay. They're just a bedroom with a TV and, electricity. They use outhouses. And believe it or not, I'm probably the only woman my age that grew up with an outhouse and still uses an outhouse.
How many woofers do you think you've gone through in all those years?
How many woofers? Well, we were in the very first woof book, and I would say excess of 1,000. You know, I think right now at the farm there are 5. At some points this summer we had up to 15. And they're wonderful. There's very, very occasionally